good afternoon or good evening. And if you're tuning in from the United States on the East Coast, it's 12:30 p.m. And we're a little bit early with the time change in the UK and in Ireland at 4:30 p.m. But welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Miriam Nihan-Gray, and this is our third installment in the fall 2023 programs of Black, Brown and Green Voices. I'm really honored to be with you today to share in a conversation with Rachel L. Swarns, the author of this really, really wonderful, important intervention into the arc of the American experience over the last 150 or so years. And we're going to speak about this obviously a little bit more. I'm going to run through just some housekeeping matters before I hand over to my colleague, Kim DaCosta, who will formally introduce Rachel. And I just want to point out that we do have closed captions enabled. So if you need that facility, just click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. We are recording today's event and it will be published online on the Glucksman Ireland House NYU YouTube channel, which we'll share the link for later. We'll run for about 60-70 minutes or so. The first 35-40 minutes, Rachel and I will chat and Kim will come in at times. And we are, open to questions and comments. Please do feel free to post them in the functions at the bottom of the screen. I'd like to thank the teams at Glucksman Ireland House and African American Irish Diaspora Network for their support in mounting this programme, as well as the Government of Ireland's Emigrant Support Programme administered through the New York Irish Consulate. Our promotional partners were always so grateful for their support as well. NYU's John Brademas Center, NYU's Office for Global Inclusion, and at NYPL Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. We couldn't get the word out in as effective a way as we can with your support. So thank you so much for that. Now let me hand over to Professor Kim DaCosta, who collaborates with these programs through NYU and the African American Irish Diaspora Network. Handing over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Miriam. It's such a great pleasure to introduce Rachel L. Swarns, who is a journalist, author, and associate professor of journalism at New York University. She writes about race and race relations as a contributing writer for the New York Times as well. Her articles about Georgetown University's roots in slavery touched off a national conversation about American universities and their ties to this painful period of history. Her work has been recognized and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the Biographers International Organization, the MacDowell Artist Residency Program, and others. In 2023, she was elected to the Society of American Historians. Her latest book, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church, was published by Random House in June and is the focus of today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Kim. Rachel, welcome, and thank you for allowing us the opportunity through our networks to speak about this book. I want you to, in the interest of not assuming that people know the background to it and its pretty long gestation, I kind of want to set the tone with your permission reading the penultimate paragraph in the prologue of your wonderful writing. The arc of the Mahoney family's experience from their 17th century enslavement, first by Catholic gentry and then decades later by Catholic priests, to their 21st century negotiations with both the Church and Georgetown over reparations, tells the singularly American story of a country and institution built on forced labor and its halting efforts to grapple with what some have described as our nation's original sin. Can you, I'm just raising the volume there, someone's just asked, can I ask you, Rachel, to elaborate on what I've just read there from your beautiful words, to tell us about the 272 and where it all began?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege to be here. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about this book and about this history. which is history that we all live with today and grapple with, I hope. So yeah, this emerged from an article that I wrote back in 2016, which happened almost completely by accident. A Georgetown alum reached out to a colleague of mine. I was then a full-time correspondent at the New York Times, pitching a story about an 1838 slave sale that had benefited Georgetown. And, she was intrigued, but uncertain, because was this even a story, a 19th century slave sale for an American newspaper in, 2016? But she remembered that I had done some research. My first book was on Michelle Obama's enslaved ancestors. And so she reached out to me, and I knew immediately that it was a story. And I was really both compelled and astonished, because it was the story of some of the nation's most prominent Catholic priests, who were also among the nation's, one of Maryland's anyway, the largest slaveholders in Maryland. And when times got tough, they did what a lot of people did, which was sell off their assets. And in this instance, 272 men, women, and children, to save Georgetown, which was the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning. And I happen to be Black and Catholic myself. And I was like, priests enslaved people? Priests bought and sold people? How is it that I didn't know? And I wanted to know more about these priests, and I wanted to know more about these families. And so I wrote, these articles, and then I dove into, trying to get a book done.
So what we're about in the African American Irish Diaspora Network, we come into contact, Rachel, with people who DNA sometimes, and the advances that we have now in access can be so instructive or life-changing or interesting in terms of people's family history. And you lay that out in terms of what I love about what you do in the 272 is, I'm a historian, so I love the history, even the sadness and what these people endured and the darkness. And I commend you, if I can say at this early point in the conversation, I commend you on making a very brutal topic very readable, and the way you present the lives of these people and their descendants, and going back to the DNA thing, you bring it up to the present in terms of there were people out there who had descended from these people. But initially, from what I can gather, there had been an assumption, or there had been some kind of rhetoric that nobody had survived this, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about all that?
That's right. So this Georgetown alum had heard about this 1838 slave sale, because students at Georgetown were protesting about that two of the priests, Irish American priests, who had orchestrated this sale, their names were on buildings at Georgetown, and the students wanted the names off. So there was a protest. Georgetown removed the names. The university had been planning on doing it anyway. But this alum wanted to know more and reached out to a member of a working group that Georgetown had established to dig into this history. And the professor told him, oh, descendants? No, they all died. And the alum, a guy by the name of Richard Cellini, said, all of them? Like, all of them died? He said, yep, all died. He didn't believe it. He thought that was preposterous. Nearly 300 people, they all died. How could that be? And he is a white guy who, up until that moment, had not been really deeply involved in social justice or racial justice issues, but he loved Georgetown, and he kind of felt like Georgetown owed its existence to these people. And so he felt like he had to do something. And what he did was hire a team of genealogists to try and see if he could identify descendants and connect this history to kind of where we are right now.
So do you you mentioned the Irish American angle, and I suppose, Rachel, that's part of the reason, I asked you if you'd consider being on the program, these programs, to speak about this important book. The Irish are everywhere, and we celebrate at times their role in the American Catholic Church. And they're all over this story, often as in bad ways and sometimes in good ways. What struck me when I first read about the project was that the family you track, mostly the Mahoney family, they've an Irish name. Did you find out, and I know this brings us into very, very dark aspects sometimes of the Irish American and American experience around slavery. Do you know how that came about, or anything like that? And maybe elaborate a little bit more on the Irish American angle of this whole story.
Right. So, I think it's really interesting when I say that I was surprised as an American Catholic that there was even this history. In part, that's because, enslaved people have been largely left out of the origin story that's traditionally told about the Catholic Church. And so if you go back and research as I've done, you find out, very much the opposite, that, slavery was really foundational in the emergence of the church here. And so this family, this Mahoney family, their experience across the generations kind of mirrors the emergence of the church and its reliance on slaveholding. And, what happens is, if I can give you a brief history and kind of with the church and how the Mahoney family comes in, and to answer your question, at least to think a little bit about where that name came from. You have these priests who arrive in the British colonies in Maryland in the 1600s. In 1634, Maryland established in part as a refuge for Catholics who had experienced discrimination in England. And they has come originally really hoping to minister to indigenous peoples. And at first they rely on an indentured labor force. But the economy changes, and by the end of the 1600s, early 1700s, they're relying on an enslaved labor force. And it's in the middle of all of that the matriarch of the Mahoney family that I write about arrives. She arrives as an indentured servant too. She's a Black woman who arrives as an indentured servant, who has her contract and believes that she is going to, serve her years of service and go on to live a life as a free person. But the economy is changing. She's forced into slavery. Her contract is burned. And she becomes part of this group of people that end up being enslaved by first Catholic gentry and then Catholic priests. So what we know about Anne Joyce is that she had a number of mixed race children. And we don't know kind of the origins of that, but we know that she was enslaved, and so she may have been raped, and we don't, the Mahoney name probably comes through, that, because her surname was Joyce. Her descendants are known as Mahonies.
Right. Kim, did you want to come in there, or will I keep going, or
keep going?
Keep going. Sorry. I wasn't sure if you were. I didn't want to be cutting across you completely and dominating, Rachel. It's so fascinating. So one of the things as well, I suppose, Rachel, in revisiting, and I know a bit of history, but just like I guess for our people listening today, and for people as they read the book, how you kind of build up the context of the lives that these, enslaved people and the community. And then you know, the Father Carberry, this Irish, he may be Irish born priest who's with them for a long time, and seems to be somewhat of a protector on one level, in terms of keeping at least some of this family together. Um, would you mind, for people watching and who haven't read the book yet, laying out a little bit about, so it's not only the breakup of the community and the families by sending them south, but what was involved in terms of them being sent to a place like Louisiana at this moment in time? I mean, the daily, their daily existence, the labor, the conditions and everything, it's kind of tough stuff, but I think it's important maybe for us to be reminded of what was entailed in that kind of, in the movement of them in that way.
Right. And so, yeah, my entry point into this history was this 1838 sale. And, you know, these families, as I mentioned, I'm focusing on the Mahoney family, had lived in Maryland for generations. You know, this family from the late 1600s. And Anne Joyce's descendants, she told this story, you know, and her descendants told it, and their descendants told it, you know, our liberty was stolen, we should be free people. And that story kind of persisted across time. Some of her descendants killed an overseer and were executed. Some sued the Jesuits in court to try to get their freedom. Harry Mahoney saved the church's wealth in the War of 1812. And was promised that neither he nor his family would ever be sold, and that promise is broken in 1838. So 1838 is this moment when the priests, and as I mentioned, these, and we'll talk more about these two particular priests later, I'm sure, decide that actually there's a vision that they have of the Catholic Church that's quite different from this church that has been a plantation-based rural church. It's they're looking north, and they're looking at the waves of Irish and other European immigrants pouring into the cities, and they say, we need to be focusing on that. That's the future for the Catholic Church. We need to build colleges. We need to support those folks. We also need to get rid of these debts that we've built up here in Maryland. And so to do that, they decide to do this sale. And they are basically taking families, as I mentioned, who have been here for generations, sending them to the deep South, to a very different kind of economy. You're talking about sugarcane, you're talking about cotton, and it is a far more brutal regime, which both the enslaved and the priests are well aware of. And even though there are conditions sent from Rome about keeping families together, that doesn't happen, and many families are torn apart.
Yeah, Rachel, that was something that really jumped out to me about how, and especially in light of what these people lived through over generations, how and I guess it's Anne Joyce's original story, how it remains somewhat intact orally. And you know, I mean, what you've done is in such a great way historically document going back over time, but it had come down, it had endured in spite of everything, and the geographical displacement and everything involved. And I've seen that before in terms of oral histories where like a sliver, and it's so easy sometimes to kind of diminish it or say, oh, that can't be true, it's oral history, it's family lore. But you were able to find truth in some of those aspects of the history here, right?
That's right. That's right. It really was persistent, and the Mahoney family remains intertwined with the priests, you know, well into the 20th century. And they knew this story of Anne Joyce and of this stolen freedom. What they didn't know was about the Georgetown angle. So the Maryland, the folks who ended up staying in Maryland, I talk about two sisters in this 1838 slave sale. We'll talk about the priests more, but one sister is warned and flees to the woods with her mother. The other sister, doesn't make it and ends up being shipped off with her two young children to Louisiana. The Louisiana side loses that story,
Right.
but the Maryland side, who remain and remain connected to the Jesuit priests, up into the 1980s, 90s, keep that story.
To go back to the Irish angle, and maybe then it's an entree for us to speak about Mulledy, if I'm pronouncing his name right, and McSherry, right? These are the two prominent players. It's so sad to think about the type of Ireland these people or their ancestors had left, and how quickly types of oppression, not the exact, there wasn't slavery in the same way in Ireland that there were in other places, but Irish people in this period, Irish Catholics in this period, poor Irish Catholics, knew the sting of oppression and discrimination. And what's so tragic about the story for me reading it as someone interested in Irish and Irish American history is how quickly they become the oppressor and the brutalizers on some level, so maybe if we can talk about those two characters a little bit, Rachel, and then maybe just talk about that, because then I want to bring in Georgetown a little bit more.
It's such a, especially for us today, it is so hard to wrap our minds around, because you're absolutely right. Not only did, many of the ancestors and family members of priests experience, no discrimination, in Europe, but they knew it here. They knew it here. Catholics were discriminated against in Maryland. They were barred of all kinds of restrictions in terms of, political rights, all kinds of things. And yet, slaveholding, the enslavement of people, the buying and selling of people became so much of what they did. And just to give people a sense before I introduce our two of our important characters, priests who enslaved people and sold people established the nation's first archdiocese, established the nation's first cathedral, established the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. Priests who operated a plantation and sold people established the nation's first Catholic seminary. And John Carroll, the first archbishop, talked openly about, slavery, using slavery. It was used to found and fund Georgetown. He describes, trying to deal with the debts of one of the plantations by selling, quote, a few unnecessary Negroes. It was really part and parcel. And these two priests, Thomas Mulledy and William McSherry, were really interesting because they were part of a new generation, an American-born generation of Jesuit priests. They were both Irish American, and they were sent to Rome, they were groomed for leadership, and they were interesting because both of them knew slavery up close. Both of them grew up in households where, their fathers enslaved people. McSherry's father was from Ireland, very wealthy, and enslaved many people. Mulledy's father, originally from Ireland, struggled, and so enslaved a smaller amount of people. But they could see that Black people were commodities. And again, when they came to leadership of Georgetown and of the Maryland Jesuits, almost immediately in the 1830s, they start pressing Rome to say, the future that we see is north. we need to position ourselves to do that, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to sell these people. There's resistance from Rome, concern about Rome, from Rome. It's important to know that Catholic priests, unlike some of other white people at the time, did not view, enslaved people as brutes or as animals. They viewed them as human beings with souls, and with souls that needed tending. In fact, that they had an obligation to tend and nurture, at the same time that they could buy and sell their bodies, which is this thing that we struggle with. It was legal, and there was no bar from Rome. But, the leader of the Jesuits worldwide in Rome was still concerned about this. And because he did believe that these folks were human beings. And he even says, there's a great quote about him saying, we don't want to lose our souls in the sale of these people, because there was concern about that. But these two prominent Irish Americans were critical in this sale, and also in positioning the Jesuits. In fact, this vision that Milady had was right, of course. He was right that the future was North. It's just, the cost that they were willing, to take to make it possible was something that's hard for us to understand right now.
Can you say a little bit more about how they square that circle? Like, how do you do both things and like sell people and not lose your soul?
So yeah, so for instance, they would say, first of all, there was a focus, it was kind of inconsistent at times, about making sure that enslaved people were Catholic, had the opportunity to participate in the sacraments, sometimes forcibly. There were efforts to instill Catholicism, and for those who were devout to allow for that. So for instance, in the sale, they were very focused on trying to make sure that the enslaved would end up in a place where they could continue their faith, where they could continue to practice. And they settled on Louisiana in part because of that. The other thing that the priests would often say, they would say that they were better than other enslavers because for them, marriage and family bonds were important. The sacrament of marriage was important. Family baptism of children, was important. And the sacramental records do bear that out. So I think they would say those things, but even though they did, and it's certainly documented that they thought about, keeping families together. If you were going to sell people, a couple, for instance, and some of the enslaved people were married to people on other plantations, Rome said, no, you can't sell a wife without the husband. You have to buy that person or they stay. There was concern about elderly and about children. So I think that's what they would say. I think there is just this, Rome had condemned the enslavement of the indigenous, in the Americas, but not of Black people. And so when people opposed, priests raised concerns about the sale, often it was about the sale, not about this enslavement, but about the selling. So that's the best I can do. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Rachel,
Well, it's important to say, I always say this, it's really important to say that all along the way, there are priests, Irish priests and Irish American priests who are raising questions, raising concerns. And I always say that that's really important because, if you are writing about or talking about, slavery. There are folks who will say, don't bring the 21st century or 21st century morality to this period, nothing to do with them. But these priests were wrestling with these questions in real time. And I often say that they were lonely voices for sure, but they were there. And I think it's important to know that.
Speaking of that, Rachel, I guess maybe that Father Carbery might fall into that category loosely, although sounds like he may sit uncomfortably in some ways about it. But he seems to have had these the kind of innovative ideas and was proactive about modeling how Black people could be productive in a way that was certainly better than slavery. Can you talk a little bit about that, or about him in that way?
And he's such a great person to talk about, because it allows for the complexity of the folks that these priests, these Irish American priests that I'm writing about. And so as I mentioned, John Carroll, I mentioned Father Mullady and Father McSherry. Father Carbery had a very different perspective on the people who were enslaved at the plantation that he managed in Southern Maryland. When he saw Black people, he saw capacity, he saw faith. He writes about an enslaved man who builds a windmill and marvels at the craftsmanship. He does this experiment that you described on the plantation that he manages. The Jesuits are forever complaining about the enslaved people not being productive, the plantations not being productive. And he was kind of like, well, maybe we need to pay them. and so he divides up acres on the plantation and says, families, here are your acres. You plant, you grow as you see fit. We share in the produce and in some of the profits. And when an Irish senior Jesuit who had been to this plantation in the 1820s came back in the 1830s, he marveled at the change. The plantation was so much more productive. And when Carbery heard about this sale and the plans for it, he had everyone in his community, white and Black, praying that it wouldn't happen. And when it seemed like that wouldn't work, he went to Georgetown himself to protest. And when that didn't work, when the slave traders came, he told people to run. So it's a very, very different kind of portrait. Now, of course, he is also complicated. For a while, I was like, Father Carbery, my hero. And so I told you about the two sisters. One of the sisters does run with her mother into the woods. The ships sail away and they come back, and Father Carbery welcomes them back into slavery, where Louisa remains until the end of the Civil War. And again, it was one of those things where I was like, wait, what? And we don't know. There's a lot I don't know, right? Father Carbery was, in a sense, a middle manager. Like, I don't know that he had the power to free people. He wasn't a senior, he didn't control the purse. And also too, he may have had a very paternalistic view. As I mentioned, for people who raised concerns, often the concern was about sale, not about enslavement. And he might have rightly seen himself as a quite enlightened person for the time, which he was. And he might have had a paternalistic view of that they were best in his care, and may not have had the imagination to see freedom as something that was something important to them, and possible.
And then, Rachel, as you bring out in the book so well, as also remarkably, and I think you mentioned it in the conversation here already, but just to come back to it, the members of this family don't reject Catholicism later on. In fact, for some of them, it seems to be a really important part of their life down over the generations. And when asking you about that, to comment, I think you've spoken publicly about, as a Catholic, an African American Catholic yourself, how you kind of separate, or how you kind of draw lines between your own faith and engaging with this kind of hard history.
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things about people say, what surprised you? So much surprised me in this history, but the fact that many members of these families who were betrayed, in effect, by the church after the Civil War remain Catholic. And it's, I think, notable because thousands of people left the Catholic Church. Thousands of Black Catholics left the Catholic Church because after slavery, the Catholic Church was segregated, both in seating, in terms of who got communion first, in terms of festivities, and in New Orleans, thousands of people left. But many, many of these families stayed, and they stayed. Not only did they stay, some became lay leaders, some even became, religious leaders, and they really worked to make the church more responsive to and reflective of, the needs of Black Catholics, and more true to the ideals, the universal ideals of the Catholic Church itself. And, when I wrote that first story, only a few handful of descendants had been identified. Of course, now thousands have been. And for them, it was, this kind of, for many of them who didn't know this history, it was this kind of astonishing thing, like, but wait, we're still Catholic. How is that? How did the families square that circle? Like, how did they do that? And we don't know the answer to that. I like to think, as a Black woman who is also Catholic, that they thought that this church did not belong to those men, that the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit did not belong to those sinful men, that the church belonged to them too. There are no letters that document that, and so we don't know. And also, and truly too, we have to consider, particularly for instance, the Maryland branch of this family. They were devout for sure, but there are also very pragmatic economic reasons too to stay. They continue to work for the Jesuits after slavery, well into the 20th century. And so, there may have been an economic imperative too. It's hard to kind of peel that apart.
Rachel, in this book, and certainly your book related to Michelle Obama, you're dealing with really, really tough history in terms of the sources, the types of, descriptions you're reading about, the commodification of human beings, etc., etc. Do you practice self-care, or how do you kind of steel yourself or not, in terms of, because you don't want it to be normalized, right, for you as but you're dealing with like a lot of sources over a protracted period that are describing some of the most awful things that can be done to other humans, etc., etc. How do you manage that?
It's really difficult. There are times when, and I've been, doing this kind of research for a long time. So I'm usually, I know kind of what these records are, I know, but there are times when, I just have to put it down. I just have to take a breath. I have to put it down. I have to, it is, it is very heavy, hard history. I would say that, I keep going because I think it's so important for us to know. As I said, one of the things that, as a Black Catholic, that kind of kept me going through all of this was, I grew up in a Northern Catholic church, right? And I grew up in New York, Irish Italian church, Black people are very few and far between. And, I don't know, knowing about these families, knowing about the fact that, of their perseverance, because I would say that this is clearly hard history, a story of heartbreak for sure, but it's also a story of resilience and family and faith. And, that kind of really inspires me, as well as knowing, that these families, these Black families were, really important part of the emergence of the church that I love. And that's history I didn't know. So I think it's those kinds of things that kind of keeps me going. Um,
I very much relate to that and appreciate your work on that personal level. Also a Northern Black Catholic in a Irish and Portuguese context. I guess my question, though, Rachel, your work has been so pivotal at dealing with some really major developments in the academy. And I wanted to hear you say more about that. This book and the book on Michelle Obama, you are doing what is, an emergent mode of historical analysis using sort of the family history as this vehicle with which to reimagine and reassess major historical events in American life. And you're also, with this book, at the forefront of an investigation into what higher education has to do with questions about slavery, what it owes to this institution. These are really big moves in the academy. And I guess, one, I'm fascinated with your ability to do both of these things really well. But I guess I'd ask you specifically, how do you contextualize Georgetown in relationship to other universities who are reckoning with this past? Is Georgetown an outlier in particular ways, or really just sort of the modal in other ways?
Yeah, you kind of put your finger on what really gets me in terms of this work. When I, got that email from a colleague, I could, my work about Michelle Obama's ancestors allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families. And I said, oh, wow, for me, this feels like the next thing I want to do, which is to look at how slavery fueled the growth of so many of our contemporary institutions, and universities are key among them. There are now more than 90 universities in the United States who are, they've created a consortium, universities studying slavery, studying their roots in this. Georgetown is really important because it was really out front, among the first to really take concrete steps to deal with this history and to deal with an emerging descendant community. So even before the student protests, even before my first article, they had established this working group to say, look, we need to think about this history. What do we know about it? How do we deal with it? My story kind of made it national in a way that kind of made them deal with it in a national way. But they really were among the first to take a number of steps. First major university to offer preference in admissions, for instance, to descendants of people who were enslaved and sold to support the institution. One of the first institutions to, say, we are going to establish, we're going to put money up here. We're going to establish what they describe as a reconciliation fund, that they're going to raise $400,000 a year, money that they are going to give out as grants to folks that are with projects that benefit descendant communities. So they really, their president traveled across to Louisiana to meet descendants. I think the descendant community has, I think, mixed feelings about kind of how much Georgetown has done and how much they should do. I think there are many, many descendants that think that Georgetown should do more. But I think that they really decided that they weren't going to hide from this, that they were going to grapple with it. And they have been doing that.
And they weren't outliers, right, Rachel? You
They
know,
were
they're
early on. It's very interesting. You know, of course, Brown was first. Brown, University in the early 2000s, was the first in terms of like examining the history. But Georgetown is really among the first. As journalists, we always hesitate. Is there one I didn't know? The first, but certainly the first major institution to take some of these kinds of concrete steps.
If I could ask an historical question as well. I mean, Georgetown also has this fascinating dimension of having had a president of African descent in the 19th century. So do you have any insight into the relationship between these two things? An Irish Black president, I should say.
That's right. It's such an interesting story, Healy. I don't, so of course, Healy is, the son of an enslaved woman and a white slaveholder. He and his brother also becomes an important priest as well. The Jesuits know their history and keep it quiet essentially. And he becomes a really important early president of Georgetown. I think it's only in recent years that he is described as the first Black president in Georgetown, because he was fair and he passed. I mean, people close to him knew, but the wider world did not. So it is a very interesting part of the institution's history.
and how he might have thought about the history
And he
that
must
had
have
gone
known.
before.
Yes, he would have certainly known, because it was so recent. Because in fact, even though the Jesuits sold most people in 1838, they held on to people until the Civil War. So this was not, he certainly would have known.
That's the other thing that I think is drawn out so well in the 272, Rachel. These records were there. I mean, not to diminish all the digging and
Oh, no,
everything that you've done, but
they were there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And and how much more is there,
And
right?
there's certainly more, certainly more. And I always say too that it's important to know that the records were there. Historians have known about Catholic slaveholding, and the Jesuits themselves have at times looked at their own history, mostly though from the perspective of the Jesuits. So there is a book that came out in the early 2000s that written by a Jesuit priest and scholar, looking at the decision making among Jesuits that brought them to the sale. But the story of the enslaved people was not something that the Jesuits told, but their records do. And so because the priests, you have essentially business records, right? People were property. So you have plantation records, you have sale records, you have letters from priests describing, people. And so, I was able to take those records and other records and kind of weave together. And as well, this family, the priests, Louisa, who stayed, lives, she doesn't die until the early 1900s. So there are priests in the 20th century who know her, who write about her too. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of records there. And there are certainly many more stories to be told.
Yeah, it makes me wonder the extent to which these records are available for the Caribbean.
Oh, it's such a good question. And I actually, my mother is the Catholic one. She is from the Caribbean. Her parents were Anglican converts. And so, I'm very interested in the records of the Caribbean. And it's also important to know that the Jesuits the slaveholding of the Jesuits in Latin America was far bigger, far more extensive, for instance, in terms of numbers than in the United States.
Rachel, stylistically or methodologically, I think I mean, it's not that you ignore the men, and certainly Harry Mahoney comes through quite a lot. But you kind of privilege the female voices a bit as well, or reconstructing them and bringing them through the narrative. Was that very, I mean, and it's lovely to see because, I guess we've lived in a world where and it could be a very male slanted story because of the profile of the Jesuits and everything. Was that something very self-conscious on your part, or just the way the narrative
Just the way.
evolved?
Yeah, I really wanted, there were scores of families that were sold, 272 people, scores of families. I really wanted to focus on a family, like many of them, that was torn apart in the sale. And my ending up focusing on the Mahonies just happened to do with the records. And then just these two sisters, the story of these two sisters, I have three sisters myself, really felt so compelling to me. They named their daughters after each other. They never see each other again. And then this matriarch, who arrives here and loses everything, but somehow keeps this story, her story, and her descendants. It's just those three women are such, but it was just how it came together.
The book has been much celebrated, Rachel. I mean, in terms of the process on this side of, and Kim and I had the privilege of interacting with you a little bit when you were still in the process of researching and writing. But on this side of it, in terms of speaking about it and engaging with people, have you gotten pushback about things, or are there things that audiences have brought up with you that have surprised you or shocked you in any way? Can you just tell us a little bit about, how it's been received, I suppose?
So yeah, I'm so grateful. It has been really, really well received. I think I say that actually one of the best questions, though, that I've gotten in the interviews that I've done was from a reporter at The Guardian, who just at the tail end of the interview said to me, what does your parish priest think of this? And I said, I haven't told him. And it was actually really interesting, because it really made me think a little bit about that. And the truth is, so the book has been very well received, but I do sometimes get pushback from fellow Catholics about it, in email or in social media, saying, why are you doing this? What does this matter? Another attack on the church. So, I have felt that at times even though to me, again, as a practicing Catholic, it felt from the beginning, and it feels to me still as urgent history. Like it is really important for us as Americans to understand, and as Catholics, how foundational this was to the emergence of our country and to the Catholic Church. It feels urgent to me. But I guess when he asked that, it made me realize that, there's a part of me that worries about that even in my own church, that maybe it's better just to be the lady in the pew and not that lady.
Hopefully he knows now. But
maybe.
Does he look like a Guardian reader, Rachel?
No.
But I was
because I think the truth is, and maybe Kim, you might be, I mean, and our viewers might know, like, if you are Black and Catholic, if you're going, I mean, and my husband and I, we travel around as journalists and with our families. If you're going, checking mass times on your phone, if you're going to a church that you don't know, too that what that is going to feel like when you're walking in the door. I mean, that is just a reality of being a Black Catholic in the United States.
But that's, David Blight had a wonderful review of your book in the Times, and I'm curious about a question that he asked, which was, he wanted to know more about the stakes for the Catholic Church of this kind of history. So, I mean, I think your trepidation about certain aspects of this, I know that's real. I know what that feels like. But what are the stakes for the church of acknowledging and engaging with this history?
So, you know, I think it might be useful for folks to know what the Jesuits have done. They too have decided to engage with this. They have partnered both, and I should say that both Georgetown and the Jesuits have apologized for this history, right? The Jesuits have partnered with a group of descendants to establish a foundation and have pledged to raise $100 million to benefit programs that will help descendants and help racial reconciliation projects. It's the largest effort by the Catholic Church in the United States to address this history. It has been slow going, and fundraising has been lagging. And one of the descendants actually wrote that he felt that there was resistance within the church, and that while some were, pushing for this reckoning and grappling, there were some who were saying, where are we going here? What are we doing here? And so I think for a lot of institutions, and like alumni would ask this at Georgetown too, where does this end? Like, this is, this is all this old stuff, nothing to do with me. Where does this end? Like, where are we going? And I think there is a concern, lawsuits, there's all kinds of concerns, I think, that institutions have in terms of, if opening the door.
Right, because the number of descendants only gets bigger.
Yep, more than I was actually speaking to one of the genealogists who that alum hired, and she said recently more than 10,000 now. So,
wow.
It's someone, and this alum's the joke, like people are willing, sometimes institutions willing to kind of do a little digging about the history, but descendants, oh no, real people now, no.
Wow. Rachel, I thank you for coming on today to talk to us about this. The Irish component to this story is important. It's puts us sometimes into uncomfortable places in terms of how we celebrate our past and our role in the American experience, and what we brought from Ireland and how we plied our trades in different ways here. And I for me, I think it's profoundly important. One of the rationales behind all these programs is that we have to engage in these conversations. We have to dig into the history and try to, in some way, get a better understanding of the past that we share, uncomfortable as sometimes as they make us feel. I just there see Kevin Kenny, who is so well versed in this history as well. I might just stop there and just pick up Kevin's comment. Unlike other churches in the United States, the Catholic Church did not split over slavery. Oh, I think he's answering a gentleman who had missed the start, was asking us about the stand. So I'll just call this out really quickly. Unlike the other churches in the United States, the Catholic Church did not split over slavery. The Catholic Church does not split. Catholic doctrine, as you point out, held that enslavement per se was not morally wrong, provided that Catholic slaves were properly treated. Abolitionists, for one, did not see how the circle could be squared in that way, to borrow the phrase both you and Kim used in today's conversation, yet many of your protagonists retained their faith. My question, so Kevin's question, thank you for that, Kevin. My question is about dissenting voices. Did you find individual Catholics, clergy or laity, who opposed not just the slave trade, but slavery? Did you find survivors of your story or their descendants who did not square that circle, or do we just lack evidence on that? Two great questions there before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I mentioned, Father Carberry, who was the manager in charge of the St. Inigo's plantation in Maryland, where, you know, members of the Mahoney family lived. But perhaps a better, he was a parish priest, effectively, right? There's a really interesting bishop in the 1860s by the name of Purcell in Ohio, and he used his diocesan newspaper to, to say things like, the Declaration of this does not square. The Declaration of Independence and what we're doing here, it does not square. And I'm going to quote what he said. He said that a people could not long survive the fatal contrast between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, the one asserting that all men are born free, sovereign, and independent, and the other that millions may be slaves. He called for the emancipation of enslaved people, and he became the most prominent Catholic leader to embrace and call for abolition. He was not a popular figure. He was the epitome of a lonely voice. But he was one of those people who said, no, this circle cannot be squared, and he was, you know, pounding the table, making that point.
We just one more. This is a great comment, Francie Scanlon. Is this an extraordinary opportunity for the Catholic Church to redeem itself in the eyes of the world? The price of denial is fatal to its existence.
You know, I think we're in a moment where, because, you know, I think it's also important to say that, you know, this history is not just Catholic history, right? It's not just Georgetown's history. People sometimes ask me, oh, how can you stay Catholic? I'm like, where would I go? Everybody has this history. The Quakers enslaved people before they didn't. So I think one of the things that I'm encouraged by is that we are in a moment right now where there is more discussion about this. There is more effort among a wide range of institutions to try and grapple with this. And so I would say that it is an opportunity. It is a moment where, you know, universities, you know, municipalities, the state of California is thinking about, you know, how do we think about this? So I do think it's a moment like that. At the same time, though, that, you know, there are countervailing forces, headwinds, folks who would prefer us not, politicians who would prefer us not to teach about this history or write books about this history. So as often is the case, we're in kind of, you know, difficult times. But I do think, you know, I certainly never expected in 2016, when I wrote that article, that the Jesuits would have pledged to do what they're pledging to do, no matter how difficult it has been in practice to do, or that Georgetown would, or that there would be this flurry of reckoning and experimentation of how to make amends. So I do think there are opportunities there, and I hope, you know, that institutions will seize that.
Thank you, Rachel. I can't commend the book more, folks. It's called The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church. It's available but from Random House. It's available in all good bookstores. I have my signed Strand copy there. I'm delighted to say, when I see you in person again, I want to get another signature on it, Rachel. Thank you for sharing this with us. Thank you for sharing it with the world. Genuinely, I think that all our students of American history and Catholic history, Irish American history, you won't go wrong by engaging with this book. And thank you for your generosity of time and spirit in coming to our programs today to speak to it, Rachel. And congratulations. It's a lot of work, and it's great to see you out the other side of it. And have you something else in the pipeline for us to look forward to?
No, I'm now working on a trying to build a digital archive that will allow people to see the primary source records that connect slavery to a range of contemporary institutions, looking at religious institutions, financial institutions, and universities. So that's
Yes.
next.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll come back to and talk to us about that when there's a good opportunity. Thank you so much, Rachel. Kim, thanks for being on as usual, and thank you for everyone for being with us today. We are recording. We will reshare this. Please share it. Please recommend this book to your friends and family. It's actually, sorry to be cheesy about it, but it is actually a good stocking filler. It's a great read. It's a compelling read. Please go out and buy it. And thank you again for being on today. Have a good evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.